The UFC is known for its vicious knockouts and fair share of serious injuries, but many consider what happened to Anderson Silva at UFC 168 to be the most severe injury in the sport's history. Welcome back everyone to your #1 source for learning about everything related to sports injuries and sports medicine news. In this video, by popular demand, we're finally going to be taking a look at Anderson Silva's leg injury suffered at UFC 168. We're going to be covering a number of aspects about this injury so that you can learn all about why this happened and how it happened. Please go subscribe if you like learning about this type of content so you can stay up to date with my future videos, and let's get started. This is certainly one of the more serious looking injuries that we've seen in any professional sport, period. As Silva goes to kick with his left leg, Weidman's able to block the kick, but the force of the impact causes his tibia and fibula to fracture in pretty significant fashion. Silva suffered a fracture to his tibia and his fibula, which are the two bones that make up the lower leg. Thankfully for him, this was not a compound fracture. A compound fracture is whenever the bone actually pierces through the skin. This is like what we saw happen with Louisville basketball player Kevin Ware when he snapped his tibia, where the bone actually came through the skin, which makes it a compound or open fracture. Silva was very fortunate that this wasn't a compound fracture because that comes along with all kinds of additional risk of things like bad infections. When we see an injury like this to any professional athlete, of course, the first thing we think about is how is something that severe possible in such a high-level athlete? In Silva's case, there were a number of key factors that led to this unfortunate event. The first factor is our body's anatomy around those bones in the lower leg. Our tibia and fibula are fairly well protected in the back side of the leg with the different calf muscles, but in the front and side of the lower leg, there's really not that much protection to the actual bone itself from surrounding muscles and soft tissues. In fact, in parts of the lower leg, basically all that's protecting your bone is just a very thin layer of skin. If you run your hand along the front of your shin, there's no muscle there right at the ridge of that tibia. It's skin, and then right below that skin is the bone. This is in contrast with our femur, or the thigh bone. In the thigh, that bone is surrounded by a number of big, bulky muscles that give it extra support and protection from traumas like what happened here with Silva that could cause a fracture to the bone. So when Silva does this leg kick, the point of impact on his tibia is right at the spot where there is very minimal muscle protection around that bone. This means there's less tissue there to absorb that force of that impact, and it all gets sent directly into the bone, causing the fracture. The second factor that led to this was the location on Weidman's leg where Silva's leg kick landed. Silva's leg made contact with Weidman's knee around the location of what we call the tibial plateau. The shape of the tibia bone, there's naturally a bigger area up near the knee joint, and then it kind of narrows down straight through the longer portion of the bone and then kind of flares back out down by the ankle. But just how there's not much muscle protecting Silva's tibia from getting broken here, there's similarly not much muscle around the area on Weidman's leg where Silva made contact. So you essentially have two bones that are only being protected by a thin layer of skin that are making contact with each other. When this happens, there's no muscle to help dissipate and distribute that load, which increases the stress that those bones are going to see and makes a break like this more likely. The third aspect of this was unfortunately due to just Silva's good skill and power. If we look at this view of the injury here, we can see how much torque he's applying through his body out to that leg to whip that leg around for that kick. Whenever his leg makes contact with Weidman's, there's still a lot of momentum that's carrying that energy forward through his leg, causing it to continue to want to move in that kicking motion. Whenever it makes contact though with Weidman's leg, it's suddenly stuck, but the end of his leg or his foot still has that momentum to want to carry through the kick, which is what caused his leg to basically look like it wrapped around Weidman's after the break had occurred. Next, we're going to talk about how Silva's injury was managed and ultimately treated, but first I want to give a quick message about our sponsor for today's video. Today's video is sponsored by The Ridge and this slim, sleek, just beautiful little product, the Ridge Wallet. As a doctor, I really appreciate things that just look and feel nice and professional and sleek. The Ridge is a minimal front pocket wallet that's perfectly designed to streamline what you carry. It's got solid construction and it's made of high quality products that just give it this really professional look and feel. I wear a suit to work every day and the last thing I want is to take some big bulky suitcase of a wallet with a bunch of unnecessary cards that I know I'm never gonna use. The Ridge wallet gives me a perfect solution to comfortably and efficiently keep just the vital cards that I need in a nice clean package, along with a really slick little cash strap or money clip to put some spare cash in the back. You can get 10% off today with free worldwide shipping and free returns by going to ridge.com/BrianMD. That's right, ridge.com/BrianMD and enter promo code BrianMD using the link down in the description below. It's a great product I think you all are really gonna enjoy using. And so thanks again to the Ridge for sponsoring the video, and let's get back to our learning. The management of an injury like Silva's starts as soon as the medical staff enters the ring. The first things we're thinking about whenever we see an injury like this are blood flow and any damage to the nerves. There's a number of blood vessels and nerves that run along the course of the tibia down in the lower leg, and these can become injured as well whenever a bone fractures. If you have any tearing or pinching of one of the blood vessels, you don't have enough oxygen flowing to the tissues below that level, and you can have severe death of those muscles and other tissues in the leg. Now, Silva was actually really smart here because the first thing he did when he went to the ground was he grabbed his leg, essentially stabilizing it himself. You can see the medical staff here in the ring checking for a pulse in Silva's foot. This is a specific blood vessel called the dorsalis pedis, and you check for it by basically placing your fingers in a specific spot on the top of the foot. And if you can feel a pulse, then that tells the medical team that the blood flow is still intact and everything's good from that perspective. The next thing you can do is have them try to move their toes or touch for the sensation on the skin to look and see if the nerves are still healthy or if they've been injured. Once that's done, you're next gonna make sure you stabilize that fracture to prevent it from moving more in transportation to the hospital. You can do this by putting any variety of splints or air casts around the leg to make sure you keep those bones as properly aligned as possible. Now, when he got to the hospital, we heard that he ultimately underwent surgery to have this metal rod inserted into his leg. There's three kind of general approaches to managing these types of fractures that I want to address. The first is basically putting on a cast and not doing any surgery at all. This could be done for very mild fractures that aren't displaced or that aren't out of alignment severely, and you basically put the cast around the leg, allow those bones to heal, and you don't need to do any type of surgery. But as we saw happen with Silva, sometimes these breaks are more severe to where you do need to do some type of surgical fixation to get those bones back in proper alignment to heal. The type of surgery that Silva had was placement of something called an intramedullary rod. Our bones have a unique structure to them, where they have this hard outer layer with bone marrow contained in the center. We call this the medullary canal, and you can insert things like a titanium rod through this space because there's not a bunch of rigid bone in there. So what the surgeons will do is put one of these rods into that medullary canal, which keeps that tibia in proper alignment to allow it to heal. The third option that sometimes has to be done is something called external fixation. This is what we saw happen with Washington Redskins quarterback Alex Smith. This is a type of surgery where the hardware that's keeping everything in place is on the outside of the body. This is that contraption that Alex Smith had on his leg after his injury. This is an external fixation device. These are more commonly done if there's been a lot of injury to the skin or to the muscles, or what we call soft tissues. By using external fixation, it makes it easier to surgically repair and correct these soft tissue abnormalities, and then go back and have those bones ultimately heal later on. People often ask when we see these types of injuries if there was some pre-existing damage or injury to the bone that made it susceptible to a fracture like this. Oftentimes we don't see any abnormalities there, and even in this case, Silva's surgeon said that his bone looked healthy and perfectly normal. And people might wonder more why someone like Anderson Silva, who employs a lot of kicking techniques into his style of fighting, wouldn't have had more conditioned bones to handle a kick like this. Let's address that question now, because there's some interesting concepts here about how bone can be remodeled that I think incorrectly gets applied to situations like this. We have two primary types of bone. We have soft bone, also called cancellous or trabecular bone, and then we also have hard bone or cortical bone. This trabecular bone sort of looks like this woven kind of honeycomb type appearance, whereas the cortical bone is more solidly packed and rigid. This trabecular bone is more often found at the ends of the bone, whereas the cortical bone is found more in the middle or the shaft of the bones. Now, our bones are really smart, and they actually have the ability to adapt their specific structure and shape based on the loads that they're trying to support or take. This is a concept called Wolff's Law, and I've seen it applied a lot to the situations where people try to do shin conditioning, where they kick trees repetitively or do things to try to make that bone grow thicker. But I think there's some other aspects of this that we have to consider that are incorrectly applied here. Whenever an area of bone is exposed to an excessively high stress or load over a longer period of time, That generates what we think is an electrical signal that triggers the bone to basically remodel and bulk up in that area so that it can handle more load. Some common examples of this is the location of your tibia where your patellar tendon inserts. This is an area called the tibial tuberosity, and it's basically a bigger kind of built up area of bone because it has to maintain all that load from your quadriceps muscle that has such high stress imparted on the bone. Another example of this is tennis players who have bigger, thicker bones on their dominant side because of all the swinging and muscle loads that are being applied onto those bones. So when you read about kickboxers who do this type of shin conditioning, this is often one of the principles that's cited here, but I don't think necessarily applies. Wolff's Law applies whenever there's been some high load over a long period of time, typically from a muscle that's pulling on the bone. This is in contrast to just repetitive, high impact types of loads from repetitively kicking something with your shin. The other myth here is that somehow whenever you break a bone, it becomes stronger after it's been repaired. This is partly true because in the initial phases of bone healing after a fracture, there's an area of calcium formation called a callus that is in fact stronger than the original bone. But what happens is your body remodels that callus back to the original healthy type of bone, and so your bone is not any stronger long term after it's been broken. I searched all the different research databases and I couldn't find any papers at all talking about this idea of shin conditioning or repetitive micro trauma causing thickening of bone. And just conceptually, it's hard for me to believe that the bone is actually getting thicker or denser after doing this repetitive type of kicking. If it does, it's something that just hasn't been studied and hasn't been quantified to my knowledge. What's more likely happening when people do this shin conditioning is there's some buildup of scar tissue around the bone, and you get some desensitization of those nerve fibers so that it's not as painful and you can tolerate more of an impact. As bad as this type of injury looks, Silva was really fortunate to not have a more severe outcome. Bones thankfully healed pretty well, and the fact that the skin wasn't broken, there was no damage to the muscles, the nerves, or the blood vessels, really make it a pretty straightforward recovery once that bone is able to heal from that fracture. The mental block is probably the hardest thing to overcome with this, just because you never know when that might happen again. So that's it for the video, everybody. I hope you guys enjoyed taking a look at one of the most kind of classic, well-known, but most severe injuries in UFC history. I hope you guys learned something here about the anatomy of the bones and sort of the different mechanisms for how these bones fail, how we treat these types of injuries, and got some good insight about this type of thing. Let me know any questions or comments you have below, and until next time, we'll see you later.